most of the people we were interviewing are over 70, and so they've lived through just an extraordinary amount of stuff, and the content in their oral histories covered a whole range of times and events, and just so rich, personal things, historical things, you know, just so much material. So I just thought we really need to be very, very clear and articulate these oral histories, so that, because, you know, somebody might be happy for this part of their oral history to be public, but this part here is quite personal, and, you know, somebody might be upset, or it might make people feel funny if that was to be talked about publicly. So we broke oral histories down into tiny little segments in relation to what subject people were talking about, and we sort of classified each one separately. And then when we went back to talk with people about it, we went through each one of those sections, and then we talked, because there are already a range of outcomes we were looking at: the exhibition, books, multimedia, web, and, you know, education, public program, those sort of things. So we went through every one of those things and whether people felt they were happy with their stories to be made public in any one of those ways, and they ticked them off or crossed things off. And then we cross off things that weren't to be made public. And yeah, so that now, as we're at the repatriation stage, we are managing all that material in relation to the consents that the individual artists and contributors gave us, or their families. If people were very, very old, we always made sure their families were present and had a sort of a sense. In fact, almost always family was present anyway, because people love to listen to the, you know, the stories. So there's a real kind of sense of everyone feels happy and comfortable about how those stories were being used. What I encountered a lot while I was doing oral histories was people saying, oh yeah, you know, my grandmother told this story for this mob and they took it to Canberra. Or, you know, my father has this story, can you find it for me? Like, can you help me get it back? And it just became really clear that these stories are so valuable. And when you're doing oral histories, everyone comes and sits around, you know, because they want to hear these stories. And when we were checking oral histories, even more people would come around and more information be gathered. And they're just so absolutely vital, invaluable in communities, these histories. And they're so rarely returned to people. You know, they become a body of research that sits in an institution in Canberra. It's protected, it's safe, but old people don't know how to access those materials, and a lot of young people don't know how to access them either. It's quite an academic exercise to try and get these materials. It's quite difficult and it's time consuming. So Carly and I talked about it, and we just thought, absolutely, everything we make, we want to return to communities, and we want to make sure that it's returned in a really usable archive, so everything is in one place, all the photos, all the film, all the oral histories, the transcripts, the audio, the curated materials that we create, just so that it's like a whole little treasure trove of material that communities have access to. And if they want to, you know, find an oral history by their grandfather, they can have a look at that. And if they want to look at photos of your family members, they can. And also younger people can reuse the raw film footage for other projects, you know, because there's just this wealth of content there that could be used again and again and again. And it'll be fascinating in time to see what gets made out of this material. And it will get more and more valuable in communities, and outside of communities too, I should add. But in communities is where its most important value lies. There's such a rich amount of historical knowledge in there, and cultural knowledge as well. Because one of the things we noticed, which is the same in all communities, I think, is that old people don't necessarily volunteer a lot of historical information about their own personal lives or about historical events without being really kind of asked and pressed. And so because we sat down with everybody and said, so, you know, tell us a bit about this, they gave us really fulsome stories. And sometimes even our young Aboriginal curators who were family for those people didn't know that they had these histories. We pretty much developed contracts as we went, and for whatever we were you know, checking off basically and getting clearance for, and to make sure they really fit what we were doing, because as I said, they were quite specific oral histories, but very, very broad, and the other materials that we were checking as well. We wanted to make sure that the content of those was really clearly covered, and that communities retained full ownership, and that their knowledge and content was respected and that we would follow what they sort of said. So each sort of contract or permission form that we created was really quite specific to the kind of content we were collecting. With the repatriation, we'll be developing a whole sort of new framework around ICIP because it's such a big repatriation project, and also because there are 10 arts centre communities involved and 10 language groups and 10 communities, or 17 communities actually. Because a lot of the content is shared content, so the oral histories are individually owned, so the contributors retain their copyright over those materials. But the film content can contain like people from 5 art centres in a single scene. So we need to make sure that that's really clear between all the art centres, and that say a young person from one community uses film that contains people from another community, that everyone's happy with that and it's all good. And then clearing things like what if it's used for commercial purposes, or do we just keep it for educational purposes, future use of that content. So there's a whole range of things, and that's going to be quite a big process next. So the project's not quite finished yet. There's a whole new phase to go. But it'll be so worth it in the end to make sure that's done really well, and that, there's this little treasure trove of knowledge in each of those communities. As we were saying before, communication is a really, really important one, just staying in touch with people, really using translators and making sure that the whole community of people that you're working with are all involved in those decisions as they're being made, and that there's a real discussion around how to handle, how people want to handle their ICIP, basically. And I mean, I think that's what we've kind of done, is make sure that everybody feels comfortable about the way we're using it, and then we kind of go up and we sort of create frameworks around what people want. And I think that's what has been such a rewarding thing about this project to work with, and that it's been really time consuming and challenging, and in terms of funding, because it's such a big project, we've had to go back again and again and again, and that's expensive, but it's so rewarding to be able to put Aboriginal people you're working with in the position of power to tell us how they want to do things, and then we do it, and it's so rewarding because everybody feels so happy and good about it, and really strong in what the ways their material is being used, basically.